Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, we're at the 3-month mark for Russia's war in Ukraine. How did we get here and where do things stand now?
So as you mentioned, Russia invaded Ukraine at the end of February, though they had been preparing it for the months leading up to it.
Right.
Their initial objective was to topple the capital, Kyiv, and both Russia, the U.S., and many Western countries expected that to only take a matter of days.
Right.
They couldn't have been further from the truth.
Right.
As we saw, the Russians spent about 3 weeks trying to topple the capital, unsuccessfully. They couldn't even get within the city limits. They were stuck on the outskirts, and eventually they withdrew. And part of it was because they were running out of supplies. They were meeting a much stronger resistance than they expected. And part of the reason they were struggling with supplies is they were so much further from where their base had begun, because they invaded from Belarus.
Right.
And so they have since withdrawn all the troops from the capital and have refocused it in the Donbas region. Now that's the eastern part of Ukraine. It borders Russia, and there's a strong pro-Russian population and sentiment there.
So this was supposed to be more favorable terrain for the Russians.
Yeah, and not only that, but fighting has been going on here for almost a decade now. So both sides are much more familiar with this terrain as opposed to the outskirts of Kyiv, which is in the center of the country. And so the shorter supply lines that Russia would have in the Donbas was expected again to take over the area.
Right.
And once again, we haven't really seen that come to fruition. We heard even today from the Pentagon that their movements or their success in the area is only incremental. And so they really haven't had success in the Donbas as they were expected, even though they're now focusing all of their military attention on this area. And so a big part of it, as this war has waged on, has been the help from U.S. and other NATO allies providing the Ukrainians with military support. And in part, these countries were somewhat hesitant because they were worried about these weapons falling into the wrong hands. But as Ukraine proved themselves, these countries became more willing to help the resistance. So in addition to all of the weapons that the U.S. and NATO allies are providing to Ukraine, some of them also required training. And so we heard earlier today from the Pentagon that the number of Ukrainian soldiers trained on some of these weapons are in the hundreds. And the objective is to train these soldiers who can then go back to their own troops and then teach them. So it's training the trainers is how the Pentagon has sort of discussed this.
Right.
And now another interesting aspect of this is NATO, which is now more aligned than ever, has been having meetings now monthly, led by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. And so the group of more than 40 defense...
These are basically Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's counterparts in other countries.
Yeah, so more than 40 of them met earlier this week for the second time now, and they reaffirmed their support for Ukraine. And an interesting aspect is it included a handful of countries that were not participants in the first meeting, showing a little bit more inclusion to non-members of NATO, but also just the Western world in general. And
NATO is potentially going to get bigger, not necessarily with Ukraine joining, but we have a couple of countries that look like they're going to, barring some objections from Turkey, look like that they might be entering the alliance.
That's right. Finland and Sweden both have formally applied to join NATO. The only problem is, as you mentioned, Turkey has issued an objection to their joining. The U.S. believes that this is a minor hiccup, and that all three sides will be able to work it out. And there is an expectation that these countries will join NATO, which is exactly what Vladimir Putin has said he was trying to prevent. And so while it's hard to really know all of everything that's inside Vladimir Putin's head, one thing that he has said publicly is he doesn't want NATO coming closer to his borders.
Right.
And so there was belief that they would invade. They've used that as a justification for invading Ukraine. And as a result of invading Ukraine, NATO is actually getting closer to its borders through Sweden and Finland.
So outside of the Russia war with Ukraine, we have withdrawn from Afghanistan, and we've drawn down troops in a number of other theaters in the Middle East. And the thought was that we were going to use our over-the-horizon capabilities to strike against potential terrorist threats in that region, no longer necessitating boots on the ground. Now, you've done some reporting and have talked to some national security experts who don't think that's going particularly well thus far.
That's exactly right. So the national security experts that I've spoken to have poked holes in the logic behind relying on over-the-horizon capabilities, in part because they don't have people on the ground. It takes longer for an over-the-horizon strike to actually launch because it requires coming from outside airspace. And so there are a number of reasons that...
And in Afghanistan, we no longer have an allied government.
Exactly. And so through all of these factors, a lot of national security experts are questioning the reliability of this, and they often point to the fact that the U.S. hasn't actually launched an over-the-horizon strike since they withdrew from Afghanistan. So how can we really know the viability of this option if they haven't tested it?
And so the Biden administration has put troops back, a small number, but has put troops back in Somalia, perhaps again suggesting a lack of confidence in over-the-horizon.
Absolutely. And so when President Biden redeployed troops to Somalia, one thing that prompted that was the growth of al-Shabaab, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate that is very prominent in Somalia. And so we've heard from a number of defense and intelligence officials that al-Shabaab has gotten stronger in the time since they left, and the U.S. left at the end of the Trump administration. And so one difference between Somalia and Afghanistan, should terrorism grow in both countries, is Somalia does have a government that is friendly with the U.S., whereas Afghanistan doesn't.
Right. So going back into Somalia was a somewhat easier task than going back into
Absolutely.
a Taliban-run Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
Today. Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.